What happens when power and obsession collide in a small Brazilian town? The story of Judge Almeida and the sheriff's daughter, Isabella, unravels into a chilling tale of manipulation, secrecy, and murder. Behind closed doors, a man once trusted to uphold the law crossed every line, leaving a community shattered and a young woman fighting for her life. In the small town of Novo Horizonte, Brazil, justice and law were upheld by a man who had earned the trust of his community through years of service. Judge Rafael Almeida was a figure of authority, admired for his sharp legal mind and fair judgments. He was the embodiment of integrity, someone the townspeople would turn to for solutions, whether in matters of law or in personal dilemmas. For over 2 decades, he had held his position in the local court, respected by everyone from the most influential figures to the common folk. To the outside world, Judge Almeida had it all: a successful career, a loving wife, and a well-mannered daughter. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, a dangerous obsession began to take hold, an obsession that would lead to betrayal, murder, and an irreversible fall from grace. It all began on a warm, breezy afternoon in late May 2018. The court had just adjourned for the day when Judge Almeida crossed paths with a woman who would alter the course of his life forever. Her name was Isabella Costa, and she was the 19-year-old daughter of the local sheriff, a young woman with striking beauty and a captivating presence. Isabella was known for her charm, her soft yet confident demeanor, and her ability to make anyone feel at ease. Raised in a family with strong ties to law enforcement, she was well acquainted with the world of justice, though her involvement was always peripheral. On that fateful day, Isabella entered the courthouse to visit her father, who had some documents for her to deliver to a neighboring department. As she walked down the courthouse hallway, her casual elegance caught the attention of Judge Almeida. His eyes followed her movements, noting the way her long brown hair swayed as she passed, and the way her confident strides made her seem like someone who had been accustomed to power. There was something about her that lingered in his mind long after she had left. What started as a fleeting attraction soon grew into something much darker. Judge Almeida, who had prided himself on his control over every aspect of his life, felt a pull towards Isabella that he couldn't explain. It was an obsession that consumed him slowly but relentlessly. He began to make excuses to visit the sheriff's office, to look for opportunities to see her, to talk to her. Isabella, unaware of the judge's increasing fixation, remained polite but distant. She respected him as a figure of authority, but nothing more. However, to Almeida, this indifference only fueled his desire. For months, Almeida's behavior remained unnoticeable. He kept his feelings hidden, careful to avoid any outward signs of the inappropriate attachment that was slowly taking root. He continued his work as a judge, maintaining the same professional and composed persona he had always worn. However, in private, he was a man unraveling, consumed by thoughts of Isabella. He began to fantasize about a life with her, one in which the boundaries between their worlds would no longer exist. The more he thought about her, the more he felt entitled to her affection, convinced that his power and position in society made him deserving of it. In early September 2018, the opportunity he had been waiting for finally came. Judge Almeida had been invited to a charity event hosted by the sheriff's office, and for the first time, he found himself in the same space as Isabella without the formal structure of the courthouse separating them. The event was held in a grand hall, with people from all sectors of the community present: law enforcement officers, politicians, and influential businessmen. As Almeida moved through the crowd, he caught sight of Isabella, who was standing by the refreshment table, chatting with some guests. He approached her, this time without the usual barriers of his judicial role between them. The conversation they had was brief, but for Almeida it was an electric moment. Isabella was gracious and polite, yet there was a hint of something more, something that made his heart race. He pressed forward with compliments, speaking of her poise and beauty, though he was careful not to overstep. He felt a sense of exhilaration with every word they exchanged, as though he were crossing a threshold he had longed to cross but had never dared. For Isabella, the encounter was nothing out of the ordinary. She had always been taught to be polite figures of authority, but she remained unaware of the judge's internal shift. That night, Almeida lay awake, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had touched something deep inside of Isabella, something that might be the key to unlocking a future together. It wasn't long before he began to plan. He started frequenting places where Isabella would be, cafes, local shops, even the gym. In the quiet spaces where he could observe her without drawing attention, Almeida began to fixate on the smallest details of her life. He knew what she wore, what she liked to drink, and the kinds of books she read. He convinced himself that if only he could get closer to her, if only he could make her see him as more than just an authority figure, she would come to understand how perfect they could be together. Over the next few months, Almeida's obsession deepened. He began to leave messages for Isabella, notes disguised as casual greetings, invitations to private events, or offers of support for her personal or professional goals. He justified his actions by telling himself that he was simply helping her, that he was doing it out of care and concern. But each message he sent, each encounter he orchestrated, brought him one step closer to the edge of reason. Isabella, on the other hand, remained civil but distant. She had begun to feel an uncomfortable tension whenever the judge was around, but she dismissed it, believing that she was simply imagining things. It wasn't until December 2018 that the situation took a more sinister turn. Judge Almeida had reached a breaking point. He had spent months cultivating a sense of closeness with Isabella, but his feelings of rejection had begun to consume him. The realization that Isabella had never returned his affection or even reciprocated his attention became an unbearable weight. His obsession, once confined to the realm of fantasy, began to bleed into reality. He no longer saw her as an individual. To him, she had become a symbol of everything he felt entitled to, a possession he was determined to claim. One cold winter night, as Isabella was walking home from her father's office after a late shift, Almeida followed her from a distance, watching her every move. He knew this part of town well, and he knew where she would be at this time. He had studied her routine, and now, as he followed her through the quiet streets, he felt an overwhelming sense of anticipation. This was his moment, the culmination of everything he had worked towards. The judge's grip on reality was slipping, and his inner turmoil had reached its peak. What he failed to realize, however, was that the outcome of his obsession would lead him down a dark path, one from which there would be no return. As Judge Almeida followed Isabella through the dimly lit streets of Novo Horizonte that cold December night, his mind swirled with a mix of anticipation and fear. Every step he took, every breath he exhaled, seemed to echo his thoughts. He could no longer afford to let her slip through his fingers. Isabella, unaware of his presence, walked with a quiet grace, her footsteps light on the pavement. The world around them seemed to grow quieter with each passing moment, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Almeida kept a careful distance, maintaining just enough space between them to avoid suspicion. He told himself that this was the culmination of months of careful planning, of making himself known in her life. It was only a matter of time before Isabella would see him for who he truly was, the man who could give her everything, the man who could fulfill her every need. Yet even as his heart raced with excitement, a part of him began to wonder if his obsession had gone too far. The street grew darker as they approached an alley that led to Isabella's apartment. She was only a few blocks away from home. Almeida had carefully planned this route. It was a quiet area with little traffic, and by the time she reached the alley she would be alone. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him, but there was no turning back now. His obsession had consumed him entirely, and he was no longer capable of seeing her as anything but his own. Isabella reached the alley, unaware of the man who lurked in the shadows. She paused for a moment, checking her phone, likely confirming the messages from her family or a friend. Almeida knew that this was the moment. As she began walking down the alley, he quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. His footsteps were quick but deliberate. He could feel the rush of adrenaline in his veins, the excitement of knowing that this was the culmination of everything he had longed for. But as he approached her, something unexpected happened. Isabella turned around suddenly, startled by the sound of footsteps. She scanned the street, her eyes searching for any sign of danger, but there was no one in sight. The darkness of the alley seemed to press in around them, and for a brief moment, Almeida felt the weight of his own fear. He had been so consumed by his own desires that he hadn't fully considered the consequences. What was he about to do? Isabella's eyes narrowed, her instincts telling her that something was off. She had never been the type to ignore her intuition, especially in a town where crime had begun to show signs of creeping into the once peaceful streets. She stood still, waiting for any movement. Almeida froze in his tracks, hidden in the shadows, just out of sight. He wanted to approach her, to take her hand, to make her see the world as he did. But doubt gnawed at him. Would she scream? Would she fight back? He wasn't sure anymore. Isabella took a few cautious steps forward, her eyes scanning the area once more. She was no stranger to the unpredictable world, especially in a town where the line between law and chaos seemed to blur, but she trusted in her ability to handle any situation, just as she had been trained by her father. She shook her head and continued walking down the alley, her pace quickening, determined to get home safely. As she rounded the corner into the courtyard of her apartment complex, Almeida hesitated, his breath shallow. He had lost his chance, and something inside him snapped. The realization that he had allowed her to slip away again, to escape without seeing him for who he truly was, sent a wave of anger through his chest. It was as if a dark cloud descended upon him, clouding his judgment, blinding him to the man he once was. His eyes locked onto Isabella as she entered the front door of her building. The familiar weight of frustration and obsession settled in his chest. He couldn't let this be the end. He had come so close. If only she had noticed him, if only she had seen him for what he was capable of giving her, things would be different. But the door closed, and the sound of her footsteps faded into the distance. Almeida stood in the shadows for a long time, his mind racing, his hands trembling at his sides. It was then that he decided. It was no longer enough to merely follow her, to obsess over her from afar. He had to make her see him. He had to make her understand that they were meant to be together, no matter the cost. The time for subtlety had passed. If she wouldn't come to him willingly, he would make sure she would never have the chance to walk away again. The next few days felt like a blur to Almeida. His obsession had taken on a new life, consuming his every waking thought. He began to craft a plan, one that would ensure Isabella could no longer ignore him, that she would never be able to escape his reach. He knew the sheriff's office, the one place where she would always be, would be the key. There he could get closer to her, show her how much he was willing to sacrifice to have her in his life. The idea of her becoming part of his world, his obsession, pushed everything else aside. Judge Almeida started to arrange his movements more carefully, arriving early at the sheriff's office and staying late to ensure he could cross paths with Isabella. He used his position to influence her interactions, making himself seem indispensable in her world. As the days passed, Isabella's unease grew. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the judge's behavior felt off. His increasingly frequent appearances at the sheriff's office, his offers to help with minor tasks, his attempts at initiating conversations, all of it seemed designed to make her feel indebted to him. Despite her polite responses and attempts to remain professional, Almeida's presence began to weigh heavily on her. Isabella found herself growing anxious, unsure of how to handle the situation. She had never encountered someone like the judge before, someone who seemed so determined to be in her life, no matter the cost. She began to feel trapped, as though her every move was being watched by someone who expected something in return. Yeah, she told herself it was just her imagination, that she was overreacting, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Almeida, oblivious to Isabella's growing discomfort, continued his pursuit. He told himself that he was merely doing what needed to be done, laying the groundwork for their future together. He didn't see the signs of her resistance. To him, her indifference was simply another obstacle, one he would soon overcome. The judge's mind was so consumed by his fantasies that he failed to recognize the danger he was creating for himself. The more he pushed, the more Isabella pulled away. Yet, Almeida was not one to accept rejection. It only fueled the fire of his obsession, pushing him further into the darkness that had been festering within him for so long. If you're enjoying this story, why not hit that subscription button and stay tuned for more interesting documentary. Days turned into weeks, and Judge Almeida's obsession with Isabella deepened. He began manipulating situations to force interactions, crafting a narrative in his mind where she was just one step away from realizing how deeply connected they were. To him, the increasing distance was simply a sign that she was hesitant, unsure, but he would not allow that to last. His mind was fixated on a singular goal, making Isabella his own, and the more she resisted, the more determined he became to bend her will. Isabella, on the other hand, was beginning to feel cornered. Every interaction with Almeida seemed to take a toll on her, even though she did her best to remain professional. She couldn't ignore the uncomfortable feeling that crept up her spine whenever he was near. The way his eyes lingered too long on her, the way he tried to initiate conversations that had no real purpose other than to keep her close. She had seen men like him before. Men who believed that their power and influence were enough to make others fall in line. But Isabella wasn't like other women. She wasn't easily swayed, and the more the judge pushed, the more her resolve hardened. Still, there was no escaping the fact that Almeida had a tight grip on the sheriff's office. His status as a judge gave him authority, and he was quick to remind her of his influence whenever he could. It was subtle, but it was there. His requests were never blatant, but always couched in the language of necessity, of duty, of the legal system's demands. Isabella was stuck in a delicate dance, forced to navigate this growing discomfort without alienating a man who held significant power in her town. But Almeida was patient, and he knew how to manipulate a situation to his advantage. He started showing up at the sheriff's office uninvited, lingering in the corridors with an air of authority, as though he had every right to be there. He would wait for Isabella to pass by, offering his help with the smallest of tasks, little things that gave him an excuse to be near her. The more he did this, the more he clouded her judgment. She had no choice but to entertain his advances, to pretend that there was nothing unusual about the way he lingered, the way he constantly tried to get close. One afternoon, as Isabella sat in the small office filing reports, she glanced up to find Almeida standing in the doorway, watching her intently. His presence felt heavy in the room, as though the air had thickened with an unspoken tension. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair but didn't acknowledge him right away. She had learned long ago that ignoring people like him, people with power, was often the best course of action. But Almeida wasn't one to be ignored. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. Isabella looked up at him, trying to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel the heat of his gaze as it settled on her. "I was wondering if I could ask for your assistance with something," he said, his voice calm and controlled. Isabella forced a smile. "What can I help you with, Judge?" He leaned against the desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "Just a small matter. It won't take long." His proximity made her feel uneasy, but she didn't dare show it. She nodded, setting aside the papers she had been working on. She had no choice but to listen to his request, even if it was nothing more than an excuse to be close. He had already begun to invade every corner of her life, and now even her professional space wasn't. As he explained the task, she couldn't help but notice the way he spoke. His words measured and deliberate, as though he was trying to control not just the conversation, but the entire atmosphere in the room. There was an unsettling quality to the way he framed his sentences, as if everything he said was part of a larger plan, one that Isabella was unknowingly walking into. When the task was over, Almeida lingered a moment longer than necessary. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was thin, almost calculating. "Thank you, Isabella. I appreciate your help. I'll be sure to return the favor." She forced another smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Judge. Anything else?" He stood there for a moment, eyes scanning her face, before nodding slowly. "No, that's all for now. I'll leave you to your work." But as he turned to leave, Isabella's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his step, something in the way he carried himself, that told her he wasn't done. She couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, like so many before it, was part of a larger game, and she was the pawn. Over the next few days, Almeida's behavior escalated. He would show up unannounced, offering her little gifts, nothing extravagant, but enough to make his intentions clear. He would find reasons to walk past her office, to linger in the corridors, to corner her when she was alone. His obsession with her was no longer subtle. It was suffocating. He would stare at her for too long, sometimes even making her feel as though she were the only person in the room. Isabella began to withdraw, finding excuses to avoid him whenever possible. She was no longer the calm, collected officer she once was. The stress was beginning to take its toll, not just on her professional life, but on her personal life as well. She had begun confiding in her father, Sheriff Renato, about the judge's increasingly inappropriate behavior. But Renato, ever the lawman, was slow to act. He had known Almeida for years and considered him a friend, someone with whom he had shared many professional and personal moments. Renato was reluctant to see the judge in any other light, but Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger. On one particularly tense evening, Isabella was working late, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The sound of footsteps outside her office door caused her heart to race. She wasn't expecting anyone, and as the footsteps drew closer, she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Was it him? Was Almeida coming again? She stood up from her desk, her instincts kicking in. She knew that something had to be done. She couldn't continue to live like this, caught between the suffocating attention of a man who refused to let go and the growing threat to her safety. The choice was no longer a matter of whether or not to confront him. It was a matter of survival. And that night, as the footsteps outside her door grew louder, she knew something had to change. She was no longer willing to be a passive participant in his game. The situation had gone too far, and there was no turning back now. The question that lingered in her mind wasn't just how to escape him. It was how much longer she could keep playing this dangerous game before it all came crashing down. The fateful evening of March 12, 2023 would change everything. It was a night of unrelenting tension, where the undercurrents of Judge Almeida's obsession and Isabella's growing sense of entrapment came to a brutal and irrevocable head. The sheriff's office was quiet, save for the occasional sound of a car passing on the street outside. Isabella had stayed late again, poring over case files to distract herself from the unease that had become her constant companion. She had made up her mind earlier in the day. She would talk to her father in the morning and make him understand that Judge Almeida had to be confronted, no matter the personal or professional fallout. But Almeida had other plans. His obsession had grown to a fever pitch, and in his mind this was the night to make everything fall into place. He had convinced himself that Isabella's avoidance was simply a sign of her confusion, her inability to recognize the depth of the connection they shared. He believed that if he could just speak to her alone, without distractions, she would finally see reason and accept the inevitability of their relationship. Almeida arrived at the sheriff's office just after 9 p.m. The building was dimly lit, with only a few scattered lights illuminating the corridors. He moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. In his hand he carried a folder, an excuse to initiate a conversation if anyone questioned his presence. But there was no one to question him. The office was nearly deserted, with only Isabella working late in her corner of the building. When Almeida reached her office door, he paused, taking a moment to collect himself. He could see her through the narrow glass window, bent over her desk, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. She looked tired, vulnerable. To Almeida, she looked perfect. He knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside, uninvited. Isabella looked up, startled. Her heart sank when she saw him standing there, his frame filling the doorway. She had been hoping to avoid him, to get through the night without another encounter. But now he was here, and there was no escaping it. She sat up straighter, trying to appear calm even as her mind raced with unease. "Judge Almeida," she said, her voice measured, though her throat felt dry. "It's late. What brings you here?" Almeida stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. He set the folder down on her desk and leaned against the edge, his posture casual, but his eyes intense. "I needed to see you," he said, his tone unsettlingly calm. "We need to talk." Isabella's pulse quickened. She stood, creating some distance between them. "This really isn't the time or place for—" "Don't," Almeida interrupted, his voice firm now. Don't push me away again. The tension in the room was suffocating. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to diffuse the situation, but Almeida wasn't interested in being reasoned with. He began to pace the room, his words spilling out in a torrent of frustration and longing. He spoke about his feelings for her, about the future he had imagined for them, about how she was wasting time by denying what he believed was inevitable. Isabella's fear turned to anger. She had tolerated his advances for far too long, hoping that her polite refusals would eventually make him stop. But now she realized that Almeida's obsession was deeper, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She tried to assert herself, to make it clear that his behavior was unacceptable, but Almeida's demeanor shifted. His frustration turned to desperation, and then to something far more sinister. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one else could. What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence and chaos. Almeida's obsession, which had simmered beneath the surface for months, erupted into a moment of horrifying clarity. He lunged toward Isabella, his hands grasping for her as she scrambled to get away. She screamed, her voice echoing through the empty corridors of the office, but there was no one there to hear her. She fought back with everything she had, clawing at his hands and arms as he tried to overpower her. Her training as an officer kicked in, but Almeida's strength, fueled by his desperation, made him nearly impossible to fend off. In the struggle, they knocked over furniture, sending papers and objects crashing to the floor. At some point, Isabella managed to break free, grabbing the desk phone in a desperate attempt to call for help. But Almeida was on her again in an instant, slamming the phone down and pinning her against the wall. His face was twisted with rage, his breathing heavy and erratic. Isabella could see the madness in his eyes, the complete loss of control that had taken over him. And then, as if from nowhere, a gunshot shattered the tense silence. The sound was deafening in the small office, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. Almeida staggered backward, his expression one of shock and confusion. Blood blossomed on his chest, staining his crisp white shirt as he fell to the floor. Isabella stood there, trembling, the sheriff's service weapon clutched in her shaking hands. She hadn't even realized she had reached for it in the chaos of the struggle, but now it was there, heavy and cold in her grip. The aftermath was a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Officers arrived within minutes, alerted by the gunshot and the muffled sounds of the struggle. Isabella was found standing in the corner of the office, pale and shaking, the gun still in her hand. Almeida lay motionless on the floor, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The investigation that followed uncovered the extent of Almeida's obsession. Emails, text messages, and even journal entries revealed the depth of his fixation on Isabella, painting a chilling picture of a man whose power and influence had blinded him to the boundaries of morality. Witnesses came forward with stories of Almeida's behavior, of the way he had manipulated situations to get closer to Isabella, of the subtle threats he had used to keep her from speaking out. Now, for Isabella, the road to recovery was long and difficult. The events of that night left her scarred, both physically and emotionally, but she was determined to reclaim her life. She returned to work after several months of leave, her resolve stronger than ever. She refused to let Almeida's actions define her, choosing instead to use her experience as a way to advocate for other victims of harassment and abuse. The community, too, was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about Almeida. A man who had been respected and admired for years was revealed to be someone far different than anyone had imagined. His death was a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the devastating consequences of obsession. In the end, Isabella emerged from the ordeal as a symbol of resilience and strength. Her story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those in positions of authority are not immune to the consequences of their actions. And for those who knew her, she was a reminder of the power of courage in the face of unimaginable fear. Power corrupts and obsession destroys, but what would you do if you were forced to fight back? Subscribe now to uncover more true crime tales that challenge your understanding of justice, morality, and the human mind. Are you ready for the next shocking revelation?